Well, to discuss the state of equality in this country as a pillar of our democracy, I'm joined here in Ottawa by human rights advocate Amira Elghawaby. She is the former Director of Communications for the National Council of Muslims. And Michèle Biss. She is a human rights lawyer and the legal education and outreach lawyer for the organization Canada Without Poverty. And from Toronto, Desmond Cole is a journalist, author, activist, and broadcaster. He's also considering a run for mayor of the city of Toronto, but it's just in the consideration stage now, Desmond, I understand. But he's also, he's been a leading voice in that city and across the country, in fact, against carding by police in particular. That's the practice of stopping people without reasonable cause and taking down personal information and then storing it. So clearly, the focus of this conversation will be largely on where we need to do better as a society in trying to achieve equality for all Canadians. So let's start with where we're at, to all my guests. Section 15 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Let's start there. It reads, every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, and in particular, without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. Desmond Cole, if I can, I'll start with you. How do you feel we're doing as a country in applying those words of the Charter in both letter and spirit? Is it your experience that every person is equal in this country?
Of course not. Unfortunately, we are very, very far from the lofty ideals of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so I think that manifests itself in a lot of ways. So, for example, we know that we have a relatively small Indigenous population in Canada, the First Peoples of this land, and yet shockingly disproportionate numbers of Indigenous people are incarcerated in our provincial and federal jails in this country. The same is true of the Black population in Canada, a relatively small population, which is seeing huge rates of incarceration in Canada. But you could take that across the board. Any issue that has to do with, I believe, social welfare, whether we're talking about children being apprehended from their families, whether we're talking about kids being suspended or expelled from school across Canada, whether we're talking about poverty and how many kids are going to school hungry, we're seeing that Indigenous and Black and other racialized groups across Canada are not faring equally. The law and being before the law is just kind of, I think, one idea. But I brought up the prison system first because the sentencing of Black and Indigenous people, particularly in Canada, and the punishment that they're facing in our prisons every day is one of the worst outcomes that you can provide for somebody in this country, is to put them in jail, is to lock them away. And when that's happening so disproportionately to minority groups in this country, particularly the First Peoples of this land, the Indigenous peoples, we can't even begin to talk about equality.
All right, we'll get into some of these issues, obviously, as we continue our conversation. But by way of opening comment, Amira, those words of Section 15 of the Charter, I suppose they speak to the Canada we want and the Canada we aspire to. Is that the Canada we have, in your view?
Well, of course, I agree with Desmond. It's definitely not the Canada we have yet, and I do believe that we are moving towards that. We can look at the Supreme Court of Canada has had recent cases where, in terms of religious minorities, we have seen in particular an effort to ensure equality. So for instance, we've had cases in which you've got different religious minorities, whether Jewish or minority Christian sects or even Sikh and Muslim community members have actually tried to have the law applied in a way that is fair and treats them equally. And we have seen that happen here in this country, which is a positive. That being said, the day-to-day lives of Canadians of various groups are not always the same. We have definitely some discrimination that does happen on a daily basis. There was a recent report by the Ontario Human Rights Commission called Under Suspicion that actually looked at the way that communities are experiencing racial profiling in their day-to-day, not only systemically, but also simply going to the store, shopping, walking out on the street. So we are getting there, but there's certainly a lot of work that needs to be done.
All right, Michèle, let me hear from you on this. Are we meeting the standards we set for ourselves in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms? And in your experience, if not, who's being left behind?
Yeah. Well, if I can shift to women's equality and look at that for a second, I think it's so hard for us to talk about women's equality without talking about economic equality. So many issues to do with women's equality are so intrinsically tied with the fact that such a disproportionate number of women are living in poverty. And as Desmond mentioned as well, a lot of those individuals are members of marginalized groups. So, for example, if you look at First Nations women who live off reserve, 36% live in poverty, 21% of single mothers live in poverty. You see these high rates also for women with disabilities and a whole number of groups. And to give it also a human side, I mean, to live in poverty in Canada, to be a woman, it's such a human experience, right? This means things like being unable to escape domestic violence because you don't have the economic resources, or being a newcomer and working 3 jobs because your minimum wage employment doesn't allow you to make an adequate standard of living, or being fearful every day that your children are going to be apprehended because you're living in a shelter. And these are, first and foremost, human rights violations.
I suppose if there's a common thread through what each of you is saying, or there's several, I suppose, but I'm seizing on one here, and that's the notion of institutionalization in terms of inequality being set in the institutions of this country. Desmond, let me have you open this part of the conversation on that. Do you see that inequality, and some of the areas you've touched on, but our other guests have too, have become institutionalized in this country? Because if they have, and that's the argument a lot of people make, that speaks to the challenge of trying to fix the problem, doesn't it?
It does. It's a great question. And inequality is absolutely institutionalized. That's actually the problem. That's why when we talk about individual police forces or individual judges in court, we're really not addressing the issue here. This is not about individuals deciding to discriminate against certain groups of people. When you read Section 15 and it says that regardless of your race, your ethnicity, your gender, that you won't be treated differently before the law, the reason that's impossible right now in Canada is because we have a colonial legal system that really recognized that white European individuals were the sovereign people of this land, even though it's not theirs, even though they invaded and occupied this land by force. And so a system built like that, that system has an impossible time looking at everybody as equals. It is not an accident that the people that we mention end up in poverty more than others, that the people we mention end up in jail, that they end up not being able to finish school or get good employment.
Sorry, if that's the biggest obstacle, how hopeful are you that it can be changed, and how do you get change?
Well, I believe in decolonization, which is when we talk about reconciliation in Canada, when we talk about 150 years of doing things a certain way and wanting to reconcile some of the problems of this country, I don't want to talk about reconciliation. I want to talk about decolonization, because as long as we continue to honor the systems that keep perpetuating these unequal outcomes, as long as we say that's the only way we can do things, we're not really addressing the problem. Decolonizing means maybe we need a different court system. Maybe we need a different prison system, or maybe we don't need a prison system at all. But are we courageous enough as Canadians to say that? Because if we're not, the same people who are being marginalized today are going to continue to be marginalized.
Is inequality institutionalized? And follow up on Desmond's comments, how do you tackle it if it is?
I think what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. So I think what's absolutely critical right now is that we do need to look at the actual data. So off the top, we heard discussions about the numbers, for instance, of young children being apprehended by Children's Aid Society, which is disproportionately targeting Black communities, Indigenous communities, for instance. When we look at, for example, how Muslims are often being targeted at the border. We just have a story that's recently exploded about the RCMP and the specifically discriminatory kinds of questions that they are asking that they apparently did not get authorization to do, or so that's what we're hearing right now. So how do these things happen? We need to start measuring what is actually happening and what is actually going to get done about it.
The point being, on this survey from the RCMP asking whether people, asylum seekers at the border, how they feel about a woman boss, how many times a day they pray, whether they, are they terrorist supporters, what do they think of ISIS. If the government isn't okay with that, it raises the question about, well, then why is a national law enforcement agency that has, in the end, political oversight, going ahead and putting out these kinds of survey questions?
Right, and we actually...
Speaking to the issue of institutionalization.
Absolutely, and we actually recently had a lawsuit against CSIS for discrimination against Muslim and Black and gay employees. So we have within our institutions these examples, and we really can't accept that politicians say, well, it's not the system, it's a rotten apples, and we unfortunately continuously hear that sort of excuse, but that's not acceptable. We actually need solutions. We need to measure those solutions. I'm quite hopeful by the new anti-racism directorate, by the government of Ontario, but the proof will be in the pudding as to whether or not actually determining numbers and determining how these numbers are actually going to be used to change policies that ensure that this type of discrimination and inequality is actually being addressed.
Sure, go ahead, Desmond.
Because I believe that point is so important. Sometimes we wonder about actions that we can take. Well, border officials who ask discriminatory questions of prospective immigrants need to be removed as border officials. Police officers who stop Black people in the street in Alberta, in Halifax, in Toronto, where I'm sitting, police officers who target us for no reason need to stop being police officers. If we don't send a message that discriminatory behavior will have immediate and serious consequences, it's never going to stop.
And unfortunately, the burden always seems to fall on marginalized communities to do this work. And I think that is a real problem, because it winds up being those who are being victimized that are being expected to be the ones to push the advocacy forward and actually get that change. And so I think that when we think about our systems, really this is about all Canadians. And I think it's really incumbent on all Canadians to be really raising alarms to their officials to say this is not acceptable. And we do, as Desmond said, we do expect consequences for those who are abusing their power.
Michèle, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one of the biggest barriers, especially coming from a poverty perspective, is the fact that we just don't consider individuals who are marginalized, especially those living in poverty, who are often some of the most marginalized, as rights bearers. We consider them just individuals as part of a system. And until we're able to shift our minds to understanding laws and policies and programs from this perspective that people have, in the poverty context at least, a right to housing, a right to food, a right to an adequate standard of living, we're not going to see much change. I can say from the gender equality front in the conversation as well, that there does seem to be a growing movement of people who are talking about human rights, and certainly there's been a lot of discourse lately about gender equality. From the poverty side, we're seeing a little bit of movement, both symbolically with a prime minister who has stated that poverty is sexist, and from a more concrete standpoint with the National Housing Strategy, Canadian Poverty Reduction Strategy, Child Care Framework, pay equity legislation. There's been a lot of concrete pieces, but what remains to be seen is whether, when these pieces are created, are they going to be tied to the idea that people have a right to these things? And that's, I think, the shift that we need to see in order to get to
I think
equality.
that's an important part of the conversation, isn't it? Because the charter, it's kind of interesting to me, Desmond, let me throw back to you to look at the sort of dynamic that takes place in this conversation. You have a Charter of Rights that guarantees certain rights, but as we've shown in our series, as we're showing in this series, the Pillars of Democracy, so often the most important the most important movement on the rights front and on the equality front has resulted in somebody actually having to challenge. So in other words, the right is specified and spelled out and supposedly granted, but they seem to have to be won in massive, long court battles. Talk to me about that, because I think it speaks to, again, the way our institutions are. I mean, here are your rights, and you fight for them because they're supposed to be there, but you seem to have to go to court a lot to win them.
Right, and if you don't have the resources to go and fight a years-long court battle against your own federal government, who will use taxpayer money to defend itself against you, then it seems that you don't actually have access to those rights. And I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, because whatever we may say about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and some of the things that it's able to provide, the Charter does not say that we have a right to be housed in Canada. So there is no legal right to perhaps the most basic human need, which is, besides food and water, which is not also a right under the Charter, to have a roof over your head, to have a shelter. So the thing about it is that we end up having to fight our own government for things that should be obvious. And this is where government really fails us, because, you know, if we lived in a village of 100 people, and that's all that Canada was. Imagine one or two of the poorest people having to fight the other 98 who have all the resources to say, you all have a shelter and I don't. This is not an appropriate way for us to make decisions in Canada, and I'll draw attention to one specifically. It's been almost 2 years now since the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ordered the Trudeau government to equalize child welfare funding for First Nation kids who live on reserve. So First Nation kids who live on reserve are getting less money for child welfare than everybody else in the country. And a court ruled that that's just plain old discrimination and that it has to be fixed immediately. Not only has the government of Justin Trudeau not fixed this immediately, they spent over 1.5 years fighting this with our money. These are decisions that I find hard for a government that says its priority, its biggest responsibility is to have a good relationship with First Nations and Indigenous people.
Michèle?
Yeah, and to build on what Desmond is saying, because I think that's a really critical point, if we look at the history of the right to housing as it's been argued in the court system, we can look at a case called the Tanujaja case, or the right to housing case. And in that circumstance, a number of individuals were arguing their rights under Section 15 and Section 7 to housing. And in that case, the Attorney Generals of Ontario and Canada argued not only against that interpretation of the Charter, but that it shouldn't even be heard in the courtroom. They filed a motion to strike so that people in poverty couldn't even have an opportunity to have their voices heard. And I mean, if you think about the gravity of what that is, saying to someone not only that the Charter doesn't protect your rights, but we don't even want to hear about it, is a pretty incredible thing.
Mm-hmm. Amira?
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, and there's something really worrisome when we know that these issues can be politicized very easily. So even what is, you know, with the current government that we have and all of the work that clearly needs to be done, as Desmond is pointing out and as we're hearing, the point becomes when you do have a government that won't even support human rights. And for instance, as the previous government actually removed the Court Challenges Program, which was a specific fund that would actually allow Canadians to access money to challenge and stand up for their human rights, and that was removed. So
it's been brought back. I mean,
it's been brought back, but
I'm not sure how many people know about it, how many people use it.
Well, that's right, and so advocacy organizations will use it, but the point becomes when you've got these very critical fundamental rights that again impact all Canadians, whether everyone critical fundamental and the previous thing, the point becomes when you do have a government that won't even support human rights. And for instance, as the previous government actually removed the Court Challenges Program, which was a specific fund that would actually allow Canadians to access money to challenge and stand up for their human rights, and that was removed. So
it's been brought back. I mean,
it's been brought back, but
I'm not sure how many people know about it, how many people use it.
Well, that's right, and so advocacy organizations will use it, but the point becomes when you've got these very critical fundamental rights that again impact all Canadians, whether everyone realizes it or not, the point becomes, why can it be politicized? How can we allow that as a country when these should be fundamental, foundational rights that are simply guaranteed? And we have to have, again, checks and balances to ensure that they are, and that has to be done outside of the government structure in the sense of, you know, it cannot be based on which government is in power and how sympathetic or not are they to the fundamental issues.
Let me ask this. As a nation, we accept about 300,000 new immigrants a year. We've decided as a nation that that's a policy that is desirable, beneficial for all kinds of reasons. And And yet it's my sense that the debate over equality and justice is going to keep ramping up. It's going to become more important as Canada changes. And some people will feel comfortable with the change, some people will not. But we've decided as a country this is the change we want to make. So that leads me to this question. We've seen how coarse the debate over immigration, over differences, over tolerance can become. And we've seen it in this country, we've seen it in other countries. But it seems to me that the debate is necessary, the discussion is necessary. Is there a way to have the discussion that results at the end of the day in more tolerance, not less? Because we've seen these debates tear communities apart, tear some countries apart. What's the right way to do it that ends up with a larger common understanding of each other as opposed to a larger intolerance?
I think what's most frightening, if I can jump in, is the way that people are receiving information nowadays, right? So actually, I don't think that we've all fully grasped how serious it is that many of us can walk around all day long on our social media feeds in our own bubbles and being given information that reinforces a particular worldview. And so, for instance, we see a rise in right-wing extremism here in this country. We see hate groups with, for instance, up to over 40,000 members of one called La Meute, for instance, which is an anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant group in Quebec, when in fact we've had just recently the Canadian Forces order some of its own members who had become members of that group from joining. So we have now almost these sort of echo chambers of hate, of intolerance, of xenophobia, and people can sort of exist in those echo chambers without ever having to have access to actual information or engagement with other faith, other traditions, other different racialized communities. And so this is very troublesome, I think, for the future. And I think it is an issue that I don't have any answers for, but that we need to be thinking about if we want to keep preserving and growing our democracy.
Desmond, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I want to say two things about this. The first is that I'm going to go back to the idea of decolonization now. I mentioned that white Europeans did not originally occupy these territories, that they took them by force. It is those white Europeans who created our immigration system to privilege their own families and their own descendants and to make it extremely hard for other groups of people to immigrate here. That's why I don't think we can keep having the immigration system that we have and have the kind of conversation, Peter, that you're talking about, because that whole immigration system is created on the idea that white Europeans are the natural people of this country and that everybody else needs to be really thoroughly checked and vetted and monitored in case they have some different intention. We see people as economic units for the benefit of us as Canadians rather than human beings who are living on this planet with the rest of us. The other thing I'd like to say is I have encountered in my work lots of people who are in immigration detention today in Canada, who are being held in maximum security prisons, not because they've committed any crime, but because they don't have their immigration status settled. I have never seen a rich white person in the immigration system for a month, for 6 months, for a year, for 2 years. There's a man named Ibrahim Toure who's been in immigration detention for 4.5 years now. He's from Gambia. If you have money in Canada, it doesn't matter how you want to immigrate, you will get here. And until we start talking seriously about decolonization, it's going to be African people, it's going to be Muslim people, it's going to be Middle Eastern people who are receiving the most harsh punishments and treatments under our immigration system.
Michèle, there are points Desmond makes there, but there's also the question about the conversation. I mean, do we need a better way as a society to explore differences rather than attack differences to develop a better understanding of exactly who's living next to us and what that neighbor's really like?
For sure. And you mentioned immigration earlier, and I mean, welcoming refugees in Canada, what a great opportunity from a poverty perspective to evaluate how we're doing on poverty for others here in Canada. It's an opportunity to assess the laws, programs, and policies that we have to see whether we are implementing people's rights. And I think one thing that's really important in this conversation too is this question of accountability. Who is the government accountable to, and how is it that we claim those rights? When a person in poverty can't access housing, where do they go? Where do they go for recourse? And there's so many opportunities to create some sort of way to have a claiming mechanism, whether it's within or outside of the courtroom. But in order for us to move forward, we really have to take seriously the fact that we have international human rights obligations that we have to implement, and we have to implement from a perspective of accountability within the context of a claiming mechanism.
Our time is almost coming to a close here. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you all in advance. But where do you think we'll be in a decade from now? Will we be closer to full equality for all Canadians, or where we are, maybe even further behind? Amira?
I think what's been happening south of the border, so the elephant in the room per se, is Donald Trump and the impact that he has had on these conversations. And while it's been very difficult, I think, for anyone to watch what's been going on there when it comes to almost any policy issue, I think the benefit has been is that many here in Canada have been saying, wait a minute, we don't want hate to be given license in this manner. We don't want societies to be torn apart or people to feel divided and against one another. And I think that provides an opportunity to, again, reinforce what it is we want in our communities. How are we going to build inclusive communities? And I think education has to be at the forefront of all of these conversations. I think every human being's heart is love, and I think that we need to emphasize love and why it's not just a good thing, but something that will benefit all of us. And I think that we are fortunate in Canada, while we have our challenges, we have also learned from our Indigenous brothers and sisters, which have this concept of the circle as being central to our communities. And when you have newcomers coming, you enlarge the circle to welcome more people. And I think those sorts of values that were here before white settlers are the types of values that we should be going back to really reinforce why Canada is and has the potential that it does.
Desmond, let me ask you, as a final comment as we wind down our conversation, 10 years from now, closer to equality in this country for everyone, or maybe further away?
Well, this might seem grim, but the choices that we've been making over the last 30 or 40 years have already kind of sealed our fate for the next 10 or 20. We actually can't start dealing with climate change in 5 or 10 years, as much as we might want to. Excuse me. We can't start dealing with inequality in 5 or 10 years, much as we may want to, because we've allowed ourselves to slip so far behind on many of these issues that it's going to take a really long time, a generation at least, I think, to start to see changes, to start to turn ourselves around. And I think that that's one of our big problems, is that we want to see things happen immediately. We're so impatient. We have a very immediate gratification society. So if we want change to start happening 10, 20 years from now, we'd better really start dramatically changing things now. The incremental change that most of our politicians are offering us today will not get us the equal future that we want 10, 20, 30 years from now. It's time to be bold.
Michèle?
Yeah, I think Desmond makes a really good point about the need to understand that this isn't going to change overnight. This is a long process that's going to unfold as we slowly move towards equality. One thing I will mention is, we have these Sustainable Development Goals, which Canada has signed on to address things like ending poverty and gender equality by 2030. So, we have the goals. The goals are there, and along with lots of countries, there does seem to be, other than the U.S. perhaps, there does seem to be a bit of momentum towards heading towards equality. But what it will take is a big commitment from this government to ensure that we're really moving in that direction so that we can meet those goals eventually.
All right, thank you all very much. It's been a really good conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, and our viewers watching along as well. Desmond Cole in Toronto, thank you again. And let us know if you're going to be running for Mayor of Toronto. We'll pay close attention
I will.
to what's happening there. Amira Elghawaby and Michèle Biss, thanks for your time. Take care.
Thank you.